things feel more grave. My older son, who is more socially aware because he is older, he's 11 now, um, had said, I really just wish I could just not worry about this. I want, like, Mom, why do I have to worry about this in this part of my life?
Yeah.
And I just said, I'm sorry that you've had to worry about this. I didn't have to worry about anything like this. And I know that that's from a place of privilege to not have had to worry about it. Um,
Yeah.
when I grew up in the 80s and 90s, just felt like in some ways a simpler time. I don't think that children were experiencing existential crises in the United States the way, certainly other parts of the world have had those for decades, but I think something of this scale, where millions of children are marching and children are anticipating that in several decades, the world as they know it is not going to be what it is now. It absolutely has impacted them.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Today we speak about conscious parenting while facing collapse with psychiatrist and loving mother, Dr. Ellen Herbst. Welcome to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, and this will also be posted in our special focus series, Take My Hand, Conscious Parenting in a Time of Stolen Dreams. And this is someone who's remarkably equipped to handle either side of that conversation, the Poetry of Predicament side or the Take My Hand side of this podcast adventure. Had the pleasure of briefly meeting Ellen Herbst, Dr. Ellen Herbst, and through someone, if you've watched this series, either of these series, much at all, you're familiar with Dr. Gillian Sackett. The conversation with Gillian is what actually got the Conscious Parenting in Times of Collapse series going. And it's through her references that I've been able to connect with a number of remarkable professionals in the field of, most of y'all have been in the field of mental health one way or another. And that is obviously such an important aspect of talking about the collapse of Earth and human systems, whether we're talking parenting or we're just talking being a human being in daily life at any level of our culture, global culture. And Ellen, I was so pleased when we got a chance to have an earlier conversation to just get to know one another a little bit. There was so much overlap. Mm-hmm. And I am so grateful for professionals like yourself in the mental health world that are shifting your much needed attention to this, what I believe will be an exploding need around the world for mental health at a scale that I think is far beyond anything therapeutically we could possibly offer. Mm-hmm. Just for the sheer scale of it. We already don't have enough mental health facilities. Let's just talk about the United States for a moment. We don't have enough at scale to just handle the world in its pretty much denial-prone mm-hmm. state that it's in, much less when we all become one way or another more collapse aware. So I thank you so much, Dr. Herbst, for joining us, and also secondarily for the generosity of you being willing to share on the more personal side as being a parent and being as collapse aware as you are. I look forward to both sides of this conversation, and I just thank you so much for taking your precious time to contribute to this series. It means a tremendous amount. And so the first thing I'd like to do, other than warmly welcome you, is to ask, could you fill in what must be massive gaps in my brief introduction of you? Could you tell us a little bit about you as a professional, you as a mother, you as a concerned human being, having crossed a threshold of awareness of what's going on in this world? So welcome, and please, if you would introduce ourselves the way you'd like to be known.
Great. Thank you, Dean, for the opportunity to talk about this timely and critical crisis that we're facing together. As way of introduction, I am an adult psychiatrist. My area of focus is in addictions, medicine, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The views I will be sharing today are not representative of my employer. They're my own personal views as a citizen, and as you pointed out, as a mother, but also as a therapist, and just as given that that's my path and that's what I've been doing. It's impossible for me to disentangle my own reaction to the climate crisis from my work as a mental health provider. So yeah, I've been practicing as a psychiatrist for, I guess, since 2002, so quite a long time. And my area of expertise is in not only addictions and post-traumatic stress disorder, but also building resilience to traumatic experiences and understanding how we can try to cope with trauma and overwhelming stress. So that seems relevant to what we're dealing with now.
It sure is. Yeah. I'm wondering if I could ask you to look back, whenever you would call your woke moment. I could point to approximately 7 years ago for my own, and I crossed a threshold in which certain words really came to the fore. Words that I hadn't really been using much before that. Words like collapse and predicament. And so there's a certain threshold that seems implied by particularly like the title of the parenting focus series that we're doing in a time of stolen dreams. Really, when we use the word collapse or collapse of Earth and human systems, as we like to talk about it around here, I'm wondering if you could share about if you had any sort of threshold moment, or in places where your realization of what was going on and the scale of it really cracked open. And I'm also curious how you would define the word collapse of or collapse of systems as you're seeing it. Perhaps it would be good to shift it to the frame of like looking at your children's experience. What sort of differences in the world as we know it, as you and I have grown up in it, what sort of differences will your children be stepping into, given this notion of collapse?
Yeah, great questions. There have been several moments. I think I definitely will avoid becoming political, but on this podcast. But I think some of the most piercing moments in my mind have really occurred in the past several years. I think if I had to localize some of them, I would say one was really when the IPCC report most recently came out, and I actually, forgive me, I don't remember the exact year. It could have been just, was it last year? Or
2018 was the one that took it from
the one that,
2100 down to 2030 and 2050.
yes, I think prior to that, I absolutely was engaged with the climate justice movement already. But I think when that came out, of course, I began to hear Greta Thunberg speak, as many others have, and would find myself in tears, realizing what these kids are really facing, what they're facing, and the fact that some of them felt very alone with it. Um, and at the same time, my son, who was 10 years old at the time, had co-authored a short story called My Home Venus. I'm not sure if I've shared that with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's actually probably going to be published in Psychiatric Times in January. But it's a it's a piece that allows him to use his creative gifts as a writer, and just as a child who can see the immense beauty of the natural world, and also this um, fear of losing what he has and what we all enjoy right now.
Yeah.
And so it's a collaboration with his friend, and the two of them put together this beautiful short story that was a plea for adults to pay attention.
Yeah.
And I think those both happened around the same time in 2018. And at that point, I realized it was my obligation to not just engage in climate justice work, but really attend to what children are experiencing, and
Yeah.
try to help understand how we can help them
Mm-hmm.
to build resilience to what is here, and what is only going to get more difficult, because otherwise I feared that they would be entirely alone. And I realized just from just a time standpoint, they'll be left to deal with this mess themselves. And I just, that doesn't align with my moral
Right.
worldview. So that's kind of where I really began to have this sense of urgency that I had to help.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And by the way, that short story, if you and your son are comfortable with it,
Mhm,
you could send it to me, and I could easily post it underneath your interview,
mhm,
as you know, to be able to point to it, and
mhm.
then people could read it. If again, only if you feel comfortable doing so. So we'll.
Yeah, that it is going to be available in the very near future as a link in Psychiatric Times. So I'll share that with you. Make sure you have
Okay.
it. It's going to be a companion piece to an op-ed that I wrote for Psychiatric Times.
Great. Well,
Yeah,
any and all of these pieces, I would be happy to link
thank
within the
you.
series that we have going on. Um, to get back to your own experience of this kind of threshold time that you're describing us in, um, I'm curious if you've done much of the looking that somehow shows up to me in these conversations as exploring the unraveling of a fabric
Mhm.
of the fabric of the culture that we've all grown up in. And those of us who are,
Mhm.
old enough to be in professional life and kind of middle age or so on like that. Um, what I notice in many of the conversations is there's a whole different reframing. There's a different framing going on of what does a future look like for a child who has their whole life ahead of them. What's
Mhm.
traditional in some at some levels of society is to be able to anticipate graduating high school, looking at the possibility of college, what sort of career direction might that take, and that
Mhm.
and then buying a home and having their own family, really just a somewhat patterned possible track, again, for certain people in certain economic um, stances. I'm curious if any of that has been unraveling or changing, or another word I use quite often is liquefying,
Mhm.
as you look
Mhm.
at your own child's possible future. Do you have any, does that spark you to say anything?
Yeah, so there have been several moments in which, I mean, I'd say more than moments, kind of uh, periods in our family's kind of realization in which we have recognized that the future is not necessarily in any way guaranteed to look the way it does now. My 7-year-old actually said he's not. I don't think he's the age in which he can really fully appreciate the IPCC report, but
Mm.
he said, "Mom, do we have to either get a family or save the world or something like that? Do can we get a family or something?" The way a 7-year-old would say it.
Yes.
Uh, and I didn't have an answer, so that's part of the reason that I do this work as well, is that I want to be able to really help them as we navigate these questions together. So he brought that up, and then my older son has thought about whether or not Northern California, where we live, is going to be habitable. This is the third year that we've had wildfires in our area.
Mhm.
This year we had blackouts that took the kids out of school for
Yeah.
one of them for several weeks. Um, there were a few days, and I know everyone has it different, and there were people that suffered far worse than we did. But there were a few days that in this area, in the Bay Area, we didn't have access to ice or refrigeration.
Mhm.
Um, so when these things happen, I think given what our family knows about the ecological collapse, I think we don't become necessarily surprised by it. Um, it is always something that, on some level, catches us off guard because um, we're all accustomed to a pretty comfortable existence here in Western society, but it's jarring when suddenly there's no ice in the entire region and people are driving, distances to get it and competing for literally just ice. Um, there were no gas stations. There was one grocery store open and long lines. I mean, this is really become an annual event to have catastrophic fires in this area, and it is completely unpredictable in terms of whether or not one would get their PG&E shut off, or
Yeah.
whether or not one is going to have school that week. It's You get about 48 hours notice, and so those are the real world immediate um, kind of observations that I think are inextricable from the climate collapse. I mean, that
Yeah,
just having the wildfires here, and I think that it's just a matter of time before other geographical locations have similar catastrophes, and obviously would never wish that on anyone. Was just recently reading about the island nations that are going underwater now, that
yep,
are facing viral illnesses and food shortages and things like that. And we know about the hurricanes that have afflicted Puerto Rico and other areas. So these are all things that are happening now. And in terms of the way they affect my kids' outlook, it absolutely has made things feel more grave. My older son, who is more socially aware because he is older, he's 11 now, um, had said, "I really just wish I could just not worry about this. I want, like, Mom, why do I have to worry about this in this part of my life?"
yeah,
And I just said, "I'm sorry that you've had to worry about this. I didn't have to worry about anything like this." And I know that that's from a place of privilege to not have had to worry about it. Um,
yeah,
when I grew up in the 80s and 90s, just felt like in some ways a simpler time. I don't think that children were experiencing existential crises in the United States the way, certainly other parts of the world have had those for decades, but I think something of this scale, where millions of children are marching and children are anticipating that in several decades the world as they know it is not going to be what it is now. It absolutely has impacted them. So I know it's a long answer, but
yeah. Well, thank you for that. And you, there's something in how you spoke when we first got to talk a few days ago, and then again now. There's wafts of it. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just go a little further in a particular direction, and that is, because we've had the recent COP meeting in Spain, and of course Greta Thunberg's still extraordinarily well known, and maybe more well known than ever, on the cover of
mhm.
Time, and the whole issue of climate change as measured by parts per million of CO2, and reducing our emissions, and so on.
Yeah.
I'm uh, you may have gathered from our earlier conversation that I'm not at all fixated on that conversation. In fact, I think it's an extraordinarily controlled narrative that offers us very little opportunity to have real difference made. But that's a
Mhm.
whole different conversation for a
Uh-huh.
different day.
Yeah.
You've been hinting at other associated examples of, if I could call them, metrics of our decline or of collapse, in their
Mhm.
own right.
Okay.
And I know you were reluctant to speak about politics earlier, and I don't think we necessarily need to go into the details of it. It's fairly well known what's going on.
Yeah.
But what I would be curious about is,
Mhm.
as you expand out from the climate change fixation of our culture, what does get onto the media is climate change. There are other measures of our overshoot. Clearly, our global culture has overshot the limits. To now, we're in the latter part of July. We hit
Mhm.
overshoot day, after which each year we are then taking, in an irretrievable way from the resources of the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, there's an extraordinary vulnerability in the human systems that we have obviously at different amounts of them, including the amount of privilege that we have that you mentioned, depending on which country we're in. I'm curious if you were to look, just scan the world in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, what are the larger concerns? What are the issues that seem to really come up like, oh boy, that one disturbs me? Is
Mm-hmm.
that a clear question?
You mean just in terms of what um, the root causes of the climate crisis, or something else, or?
Yeah, let me try and be a little clearer just by giving you some examples of my own. I started out in researching my own book and writing it, 5 years ago now. And the first thing that caught my attention was abrupt climate change projections, much faster and more intense than regular climate change projections. And so I immediately had to vet that information. I had to confirm it because it was either the
Mm-hmm.
most wacky bullshit to come down the pike,
Mm-hmm.
or it was clearly the transformation of humanity, whether we're ready for it or not.
Right.
And I vetted the latter. And immediately, as quickly as I could, I got out of the climate change conversation because I just literally couldn't stand the toxicity of the denier part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to look for other measures of our impact on the planet. And if
Mm-hmm.
I could I'll just mention a few that have really caught my eye in the way I'm asking you about.
Okay.
There's one called Year Zero, which is a part of this series that I'm posting in addition to the interviews in the
Mm-hmm.
Take My Hand series. We're going to
Mm-hmm.
have a number of other support materials, and one of them describes this Year Zero. And the idea is it's just arithmetic. It's not even a very scientific projection. It's just arithmetic to watch the decline of literally the biomass, the amount of wild animals on
Mm-hmm.
the planet.
Right.
And they've been measuring that over time. And since I was born in the late 50s, we've lost more than 2/3 of the wild animal biomass on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And to just continue that line, which there's nothing to indicate that that line won't continue in exactly its trajectory,
Mm-hmm.
we'll essentially have no more wild animals on the planet by 2026,
Mm-hmm.
which we're in late 2019. That's just a little over 6 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
That takes my breath away. That, if
Yes.
I really stop for a moment, cracks my heart open, and I have a hard time breathing.
Yes.
So that's the kind of like, oh my God, that's an
Yeah.
indicator that shifts me. And I just lodge it as a concern, as a response to my own question here. So, and if I could just give you a couple of other examples, without going into too much detail, the economic structures that makes up the economy as we know it around the world is
Mm-hmm.
at such a hyper bloated, debt-ridden state.
Mm-hmm.
And it is clearly, has always been a growth dependent system. It
Mm-hmm.
must grow in order
Yeah.
to be healthy and continue.
Right.
And clearly the demand to reduce our emissions implies less growth. They're trying so hard to keep those two things together, and for the life of me, I cannot see them staying together in any way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm going to spare everybody the details of it for a later episode, but that also, when I slow down and I really just feel what that implies in terms of that unraveling of the fabric of possibility, I'm going to I'm going to finish high school. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to get a career. I'm going to get a mortgage. I'm going to have a family.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at any of just the two that I've mentioned, and the list goes on and on, a little.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I share those two examples of pieces that have hit me in a way that has, if I've got the capacity for it, I stop and just register that in my system and keep working my own practices to be able to hold the scale of them.
Yes.
And for me, they're far larger than even the climate change conversation, and far more urgent
Mm-hmm.
in some cases. So hopefully that's a clear enough example. And I'm just wondering, as you scan your world, are there things that catch your eye or hit your heart in a particular way that you could mention?
Absolutely. I believe the statistic that I remember, again, I believe from IPCC, which I've heard from climate scientists recently, might be a bit on the optimistic side,
Mm-hmm.
is that on average, approximately 150 to 200 species go extinct every 24 hours, is what I remember. I would have to confirm that because I don't
Oh, that's
pretend.
what I recall as well. That's the 2011 United Nations report, which was subsequently updated to between 200 and 250. But let's just stay with 100 to 150. I'm with you, and absolutely
Yeah,
breathtaking.
no, I think you're right. I think that I'm continually trying to err on the side of the most certain numbers, because I know that
Yeah.
any opportunity to, if anything's exaggerated, people use that as an opportunity to deny
Yes, I'm with you.
everything we're talking about. So I try to be really to be completely certain in my numbers. But I think at the very least, I think 150 was the low end, but
Yep.
um, uh, climate scientists should be the determinants of that. But that those numbers do stagger me, and I think just spending time in nature and imagining certain things being gone, just allowing myself to accept that something may not be there anymore. And again, when my kids ask me, are we going to have, you know giraffes or elephants, or are we going to have certain types of animals anymore on this earth, I don't have an answer
Yeah.
um, for that. And yes, I agree that this idea of endless growth being prioritized in the face of some of these facts that feel so devastating
Mm.
confuses me as well. Um, and I think the interesting thing is that I think most people agree that that they that nature and preserving our world are worth fighting for. I think that it's pretty clear that um, a small number of people are making decisions on behalf of everybody else, some of whom may not be democratically elected. So again, we're not going to necessarily talk at length about politics, because I try to be thoughtful about what I can and can't change, just for my own sanity.
Yeah.
And so what I know that I can change, because I have background in it, is promoting resilience in people around me, based on techniques we've used to support people with trauma exposure. So
Yeah.
that's something that I can contribute to this fight, along with um, the grief that you're talking about. The just kind of learning to grapple with my own grief, and it does shock me that this isn't front page news. I don't understand why that is. I think I have some ideas that it would threaten certain certain systems to do that, to make it front and center, and for people to really appreciate how devastating the sixth mass extinction is.
Yeah.
Um, but again, I know what I'm able to most effectively accomplish, and that's um, my background expertise as a mental health professional.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to contribute.
Well, that's a perfect segue. I'm thrilled to have you bring that up because I am not a mental health professional, but I have been in the training business for a long time, and part of that has been I would never have used these words, but now I'm using these words more than ever, and that is about our tendency to become dysregulated and our skills at regulating, self-regulating,
Mm-hmm.
or if we're lucky, co-regulating with others. If we have the privilege and the opportunity to be with others and to be able to be supported and to support others and to generate these kinds of practices that could bring us back to a preferred state, to a state of wholeness, a state of being able to be resilient. And what would that mean? I'm so interested in how, not just how you work it with people professionally in those high need, high pressure situations of treating people with PTSD, pronounced symptoms and so on. I'm curious if you could introduce us a bit to this whole notion of self-regulation. What I'm finding is remarkably few people in the general public know anything about self-regulation. Like, what are these skills? Why would I need them? What is it?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you could speak a little bit about just self-regulation and anything else that you would call resilience skills or distinctions of resilience, both in your professional work and also in your own practices for yourself, or practices that you might have in your family. So anything you'd like to map out for us in that realm, I think would be very, very valuable. Yeah.
Sure, I'll do my best. So I will preface it by saying I think the global community has not faced anything of this magnitude before. So I think that what we know about peri-traumatic resilience is going to have to be modified first to accommodate the different needs of different communities. I think that
Yeah.
I'm a member of several work groups that have been thinking about the most vulnerable communities first and aiming to think about the communities that are hardest hit. So indigenous communities are getting hit, um, low income communities, people who live in low-lying areas are getting hit first. And sometimes that goes along with poverty and uh, individuals of color, children, the elderly,
Mm-hmm.
individuals with mental illness. These are groups that may initially get the hardest hit by the climate crisis. And so several of us in the mental health community have assembled to think about the different needs of these groups. Um, and um, there are different evidence-based strategies that one can use to cope with trauma. So when a traumatic experience occurs, um, to simplify it, there can be a flight or a fight reaction that occurs. And if one is able to maintain some kind of cognitive control, not become overwhelmed, um, it's not known, but it's possible that that person may fare better than if one were to have uncontrolled panic at the time of a traumatic experience. So, um, at least in the moment, it's pretty clear that panicking doesn't help. A certain amount of anxiety allows us to function in the face of trauma and not underreact. But if one has overwhelming panic, it can be disabling. So so there are certain techniques that are not perfect but can be used, such as grounding, staying in the present moment. Right now, I'm actually petting my dog here.
Right.
So, for example, having a an animal, dogs especially, I'm biased, but can be a great self-regulation strategy,
Yep.
actually. So um, maintaining some grounding in the present, so awareness of sensory kind of experiences, and just um, not not panicking too much about what's to come in the future, and
Yeah.
that kind of goes along with meditation and controlled breathing. These
Yeah.
are techniques that, fortunately, many children, not all, but many children are learning in schools right now to stay connected with the present, which comes in handy when things are calm and also when there's a crisis. And then there's also evidence that emotional retelling of traumatic experiences at the time a trauma occurs may not be helpful.
Mm.
So if somebody is in a traumatic experience or experiencing something horrific or terrifying or something, um, emotionally retelling that story outside of a controlled environment, like outside of a therapy or something, may actually perpetuate panic reactions. And I'm speaking tentatively because the data are somewhat mixed, but in
Yeah.
general, it is good to try to find ways to stay grounded.
Yeah.
It seems intuitive and not all that exciting, but it makes sense if one were to stay grounded. And um, it. I always cringe when sometimes on news, if there's a horrific event like a shooting or something, kids are being asked to retell exactly how they felt in the moment. That's not necessarily good for us to do that, um, public telling of painful, um, emotional experiences,
Yeah.
unless somebody really wants to. I mean, if somebody really wants to, that is their choice. But in general, forcing that isn't great. So, in contrast, I think ensuring that people are taking care of basics. So, not self medicating through alcohol or substances when there's a traumatic experience, making sure people have adequate sleep, access to some exercise if at all possible, food, um, and their medication. Those are the kinds of basics that I think um, help people maintain some degree of resilience. So, for example, during those wildfires, I think having some routine for kids, things are we're not talking about the worst case scenarios over and over again, and kind of engaging in what we call flooding, where there's a panic reaction. You don't want to shy away from that, but at the same time, you want to be able to have a couple meals a day. You want to have, maybe access to some board games or something like that.
Yeah.
Just adequate food and water and heat and things like that that will allow someone to feel some sense of normalcy.
Yep.
So I know that's not really revolutionary in terms of what one might um, expect, but I think that the best way to prepare for something like this is to maintain a degree of a mindfulness practice, and um, when things are calmer, because they aren't always going to be like that.
Yep.
Um, and then the other thing is, I think, some degree of engagement and living according to one's values. So, I mentioned at the beginning that I noticed that children are suffering. These children who were courageous enough to speak and didn't feel that it was according well with my values to watch them do that by themselves. Didn't feel right to watch themselves put themselves on the line and then have no adults. I don't want to say no adults, but to not have the mental health community acknowledge that. So I think engaging in some kind of um, civic action or um, community service, or however one wants to frame it, whether it's
Mhm.
political or not, may be therapeutic as well. There's emerging data that suggests that engaging is better than not. So
Yep.
feeling helpless, even if we are helpless, that feeling of overwhelming helplessness um, will not promote survival, I don't think. So I think I think you and I talked the other day informally about how we can try to make a difference on a small scale that has an impact.
Right.
So I think the kids at my son's school are going to start a compost program, and um, one might think, oh, well, that doesn't make a difference that much. It's one school, but there is data now suggesting that children talking with their parents are changing their minds about
Right.
the gravity of the climate crisis. So, for all the kids that participate in that compost program, I'm guessing almost all of them are talking to their parents, some
Yeah.
of whom may not have an awareness of what's going on. So, there's an amplification that can happen, and I think that cynicism is truly dangerous right now. I
Mm.
think that it's really a challenge for all of us to maintain um, the possibility and the likelihood that the warming is exceeding. I mean, we know that the targets are not being met. They're being surpassed much more rapidly than anyone anticipated. But at the same time, I truly believe that if hopelessness and cynicism set in, that just makes the suffering more pronounced and severe. We
Right.
have the ability to alleviate the suffering of those immediately around us um, through some kind of engagement.
Yep.
So that I think that that's another way to build resilience, and we're starting to flesh that out a bit in our groups.
Yeah.
I
Well,
hope that
thank you
makes
for that.
sense.
I so appreciate hearing your layout, given your perspective and your professional orientation and so on. I'm going to just get out of the frame for a second and get a book from my own library
Sure.
here. And I'd like to just mention a couple of resources that I think will be a good kind of addendum to what you've been sharing. So be right back here.
Hmm.
Yeah, early on in this podcast, I had the pleasure of interviewing a woman named Elaine Miller-Karas, and she is the founder of the Trauma Resource Institute down in Southern California. And she and her uh, agency, or the group that she has founded and runs, they're the kind of folks that not only train professionals like yourself and really at all levels of public facing services, but also train the emergency workers that respond to large scale disasters. For instance, a hurricane hits your city, and you know what can be brought in terms of self-regulation skills to people who are in a shelter, for instance. I think they're pretty
Yes.
close to what you were just describing. And I'm looking right now at her book, Elaine Miller-Karas's book, Building Resilience to Trauma, the Trauma and Community Resiliency Models. And I've had the pleasure of attending their teacher training for this kind of work. And I think it's just a hand in glove fit with what you were just describing. Like, how can we, at the simplest level, at the level that just seems so almost intuitive, I mean, they're literally having to do with breath, having to do with how I deploy my attention in the moment. How am I able to ground, meaning be present in my body and present to what's going on around me? And can I volitionally shift my attention from the source of stress to something other than that, to be able to self-regulate, to be able to return my state to something where I can have my wits about me and be a little bit more present, maybe even muster a little bit of humor, these kind of things. So I'm going to be putting the link to this book and one other I'd like to mention in the same track. Someone that I've been very attentive to since starting my own, you know, this research that I did for my book and so on. I was looking for what are the best offerings out there at scale, you know, something that's easy to learn, that it can get into people's hands, make a difference in the moment, to give us some sense of personal agency, of personal empowerment, being able to volitionally shift my state and self-regulate. So that's Elaine Miller-Karas's end of the conversation. And I also ran into a gentleman named Bob Doppelt, whose book, Transformational Resilience, I found remarkably valuable, kind of at the broader or longer term scale of intervention. And how he defines transformational resilience, if resilience has something to do with in the moment, real time skills at being able to self-regulate, to be able to, by choice, bring ourselves back to some sort of semblance of familiar and wholesome reality in our own body. Bob Doppelt has been remarkably effective, I think, in writing his book, Transformational Resilience, and talking about, is it possible that we are headed into times when we will not be having what has become traditional of, we have a disaster and then we have recovery time of some number of years where we can get the community back in shape and gather our wits back about us and somehow recover and get back on our feet and so on. What if, he asked in his book from a few years ago, what if we aren't going to have those big gaps in between? What if we're going to have back-to-back traumatic experiences on large scale? What will we do then? And what are what's the possibility for that as a community? And I've always been inspired by his work because has this transformational quality of it embedded in there. It's a nonlinear possibility he's putting out there in front of us, saying, what if we're not going to get these recovery times?
Yeah.
And what if we could set our sights not on just somehow getting ourselves back up and brushing ourselves off and getting back into business as usual? What if there was a way to be involved with, engaged with life in such a way in the midst of these events to somehow thrive and potentially grow in the midst of the events themselves? So I don't have time to go too far into the distinctions, but it was extraordinary. It was exciting to me. He was the only one, to this day, he's the only one really bringing up these possibilities. And so I will be linking Elaine Miller-Karas's book
Right.
for a full layout of examples of exactly what you so beautifully described for us. And then for those who want to dive a little deeper and even into more possibility, to me is extraordinary and exciting possibility. I'll be also linking Bob Doppelt's Transformational Resilience.
Mm-hmm. And
I'm
may I say one thing too that I forgot?
absolutely, please.
Yeah. Um, I really have become increasingly convinced in my work over the years that trauma can't be healed through isolation. So I really think that um, while I mentioned that emotional retelling of trauma to some random, you know, news reporter or something may not be therapeutic, um, I think that um, relationships, human relationships, and also relationships with animals as well, and plants, without sounding too hokey. I really believe that that human and other relationships will help us get through. And so I believe that having a sense of community will be critical, and there will need to be community responses to some of this. And I saw some of that on a very minor scale with the blackout. People were helpful with one another. People would, if we saw there was an older man that didn't have access to a flashlight walking down the street, we'd give that person a flashlight. You know, we didn't have access to certain things and our neighbors gave it to us, you know. So really, we're going to need to rely on one another in a way that's different from what we're used to, I think.
Yeah.
I can't predict what things are going to be like, but I think that we are going to kind of be in a more interdependent space as a society, I think, over time. And that's we've drifted away from that, I think. And I think there's going to be, just by necessity, a need to return to that. So I saw that on a small scale. I would see, you know, like if an older person was homebound, didn't get access to groceries, somebody on this website, this message group said, oh, I'll drive this person, you know. So little things like that.
Mhm.
And then just the larger, having relationships and maintaining relationships, not closing oneself off in the face of trauma, not becoming emotionally numb so much that we can't care. You know, just that can be really toxic, to
Mhm.
be so emotionally numb. And you know, we can actually learn from communities that have already survived crises, and people who have been in war zones and in other areas that are hardest hit now. You know, we can learn from their wisdom. And when one becomes so emotionally numb and cynical that they feel that it's dangerous to care about someone else or something else, that's where I really begin to worry with trauma. So resisting that and continuing to support one another, find beauty in little things. Those are really small but critical things to
Yep.
prevent ourselves from some of the most painful experiences of PTSD that I've seen have been the ones in which people don't talk about something. They don't feel that they can talk to anybody about
Yeah.
something. And so we need to have at least one or two trusted individuals, even like I said, a pet. I don't care who it is,
Yeah.
somebody that we feel in the world that we can connect with.
Yeah.
Um, so for what it's worth, I think that's also going to be important, because I think we're heading into a more interdependent society.
Yeah.
Um, and we're going to need to figure that out quickly.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how you keep anticipating the next transition in this conversation. I was just
Yeah.
going to ask you if you had some way of summing up some of the elements that you find essential, whether it's the reconnection with deeper self, or the reconnection with others, or the reconnection with Earth. And you've been mentioning just now, and really through the whole conversation, you've been mentioning some of your preferred methods or preferred ways of focusing on what can move us forward in each of
Hmm.
those dimensions. And I'm just curious have um, if you had just a couple of moments to speak with people who are not nearly as well referenced as you are, as experienced as you are in these conversations, and they're just beginning their exploration of this, the most daunting conversation in human history.
Hmm.
How on earth to start to get your head around it, and what are some of the ways that I can prepare myself new to this conversation? Again, I know you've been speaking to that the whole time. I'm just wondering if you had a couple of extra moments and a chance to offer kind of a bow on top of your suggestions, your own leanings in this, in moving forward in your own way.
Hmm.
Is there anything that you'd like to share as a way of finishing up our time together?
I will try. Thank you so much, Dean, for your thoughtful questions, and for all your insights as well. So I have humility in this process. I don't know more than anyone else. In fact, I hope to learn from others about it, about how we undergo this together. But I think I've just come to the conclusion that we need to avoid becoming cynical. We need to um, to avoid the typical methods that we use, that our minds use to avoid painful topics as well. We don't have to continue to be thinking about this 24 hours a day, but I think it's good not to look away from what's happening. Um, I think it's okay to simultaneously feel overwhelmed or um, some sense of lack of agency, but also to try to find some way, some small way to contribute to a potential solution, and to continue to talk about this, because I think that as a society, if we continue to make this a priority, the future is bleak, but it's also, the scale and magnitude of the suffering is not yet known. So I think there it's there I guess sometimes I worry about the all or nothing, that it's either going to be, there's going to be so much catastrophic suffering that nothing's worth ever even experiencing anymore, or nothing to see here, everything's fine. And I think the reality is it's not either of those, that
Mhm.
there is going to be, and there is currently, widespread suffering, and there's also um, smaller things are worth fighting for. What we can personally do is worth fighting for. Um, and so I think engagement on some level can be beneficial to our mental health, promote resilience, and finding the coping school tools rather now, while there are moments of peace, those skills will become helpful when things are less certain, and there's a power outage, or there's food shortages, et cetera. There's smoke in the air. Those are going to be more stressful moments. So it's better to build the skills now.
Yeah.
I know I'm kind of just rambling a bit, but I also think that people have different skills, so when I lived in San Francisco, I was part of this emergency, like I attended a emergency response team training for earthquake. And the emergency responders are amazing. They have skills I don't have.
Yeah.
They can do on the ground survival skills that I don't have. I have a lot of experience listening to people and mental health um, resilience building. That I try to view that as something I can contribute.
Yeah.
So we don't need to do everything for everyone. Maybe yours is storytelling and getting the message out and sharing,
Yeah.
and that's and amplifying messages. And I think if we do that together, we can accomplish something. We don't need to set to save everything. We can accomplish something. We can take this burden on together.
Yeah. Well, Ellen Herbst, it's just been really precious to speak with you. It's one thing to get your professional perspective and suggestions and so on, and I do thank you for those. But really, what's moved me so much is how generously you've shared how this affects you personally and your own family, and it's been so easy to just walk with you along the path that you've been describing, and to really just feel with you as you've been sharing about your concerns for your own children and about their remarkable inner resourcing that you're sharing with us as well. I think we're really blessed to have folks in the mental health field like yourself who are willing to be out on the skinny branches. I know even in the mental health field, this is not the prevailing story that is being utilized as our narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So to some degree or another, you're really taking a chance to be this articulate. And so I thank you for that. It is both courageous and very, very needed. So thank you for taking time to be a part of this project. And I hope this is not our last time to be in conversation with one another.
Thank you, Dean, and I appreciate all you're doing to build a community and to support one another in this crisis that we're facing together. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.